The city was alive that afternoon, filled with the hum of cars rolling steadily down the wide street and the sound of footsteps echoing along the brick sidewalks. The summer sun had dipped just far enough into the sky to cast long golden shadows between the tall buildings, and people were moving about with the casual rhythm of a normal day. Nobody could have guessed that within minutes, something unusual was about to happen, an encounter that would expose deep truths, not only about the people involved but about the way courage can rise in unexpected places. The yellow car caught eyes instantly. Bright, polished, and low to the ground, it glided through the street with a smoothness that demanded attention. Inside, behind the wheel, sat a black woman in her 30s. She was elegant, her posture straight, her presence calm yet unshakably firm. She wore a bold red dress that contrasted sharply with the yellow car. It was not just her clothing or the car that stood out, but something about her spirit. Even those who only saw her for a brief moment felt she carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that turned curiosity into respect. As she drove, she noticed a police car pull into the lane behind her. She had seen it happen before, sometimes just routine, sometimes something more. In that moment, she did not panic. She knew her papers were in order, her license up to date, her registration clean, and she was not breaking any traffic laws. Still, she had lived long enough to know that sometimes what was legal did not always matter as much as perception. And perception, she understood well, was often tainted by bias. The siren flashed once. She glanced into the rearview mirror and saw the police lights flicker on, a signal for her to pull over. She eased the yellow car toward the curb, calm and deliberate, and parked. The street around her slowed. Pedestrians walking by noticed the flashing lights. Some cars eased around, their drivers glancing sideways to see what was happening. That is how it always was. Whenever lights flashed, eyes followed. The officer stepped out of the patrol car, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable from afar. He moved with the sort of heavy certainty that came from believing authority could not be questioned. He adjusted his belt, squared his shoulders, and approached the car as though he had already decided what he would find. The woman in the red dress did not rush to roll down her window. Instead, she took a breath, collected her thoughts, and reached calmly for her license and registration. She had everything ready before he even spoke. When she lowered the window, the officer leaned slightly toward the car. His eyes lingered first on the expensive vehicle, then on her, then back again on the car as though trying to piece together a puzzle that did not fit his assumptions. "License and registration," he said flatly. She handed them to him without hesitation, her movements measured, her gaze steady. He glanced at the documents, then at her again. "Is this your car?" he asked, though the registration paper already gave the answer. "Yes, it is," she replied, her voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that revealed no fear and offered no weakness. The officer raised an eyebrow. His expression was subtle, but it carried years of practiced disbelief, the kind that said without words, "People like you do not belong in cars like this." He held the documents a moment longer, his silence pressing against her calm. Finally, he said, "What do you do for a living?" She did not blink. "I work hard, officer," she replied. The same as anyone else. The simplicity of her answer seemed to unsettle him more than any argument would have. He was expecting nervousness, excuses, maybe anger. Instead, he was met with dignity that refused to bend. Behind him, another police officer had stepped out of the car. He was watching closely, his eyes moving between his partner and the woman in the red dress. On the sidewalk, two passers-by had slowed their steps, pretending to check their phones while discreetly observing. The yellow car and the red dress had already made the moment impossible to ignore, and the presence of uniformed officers only sharpened curiosity. The first officer leaned slightly closer. "Step out of the vehicle," he instructed. She opened the door slowly, gracefully, and stood. The red dress flowed around her as she straightened her posture and faced him. Now they stood eye to eye, though in truth the confrontation was more than physical. It was a silent test of willpower, a clash of presence. Her arms folded across her chest, her gaze unbroken. She looked less like someone intimidated by authority, and more like someone standing firmly on ground she knew she owned. Cars began to line up behind them, the street narrowing because of the stop. Drivers honked impatiently, but the sound faded beneath the tension. One by one, more heads turned and more eyes locked onto the scene. Something about the moment felt different, even to strangers who did not know the woman or the officer. They could sense a quiet battle taking place, and it was not clear who would win. The officer cleared his throat. Mind explaining why you're driving a car like this in this neighborhood? The question landed heavily, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied. She let the silence hang in the air a second longer than necessary, then answered with deliberate clarity. I do not owe you an explanation for the car I drive, she said. It is mine. That is all you need to know. Her words cut sharper than any raised voice could have. The officer shifted slightly, realizing too late that what he had said sounded more like a personal judgment than a lawful question. His partner behind him raised an eyebrow but stayed silent, waiting to see where this would go. The woman stood tall, her presence filling the street as much as the bright car behind her. She was not just responding to the officer, she was making sure every person watching heard her too. The air thickened with anticipation, like the pause before a storm. Even the impatient drivers quieted, their curiosity overpowering their frustration. She knew this was not just about her. It was about every person who had been unfairly questioned, every person who had been judged by appearance before truth. She had not chosen this moment, but now that it was here, she would not back down. The officer, sensing the weight of the eyes around him, stiffened his jaw. He was used to control, used to situations bending his way. But this time, something was different. The woman in red was not bending. She was not raising her voice or showing fear, but she was holding ground in a way that made him uneasy. What he did not know, what nobody around him yet realized, was that the woman had been waiting for this kind of moment. She had prepared for it in silence, carrying with her not just the documents needed to prove her right to be there, but something far more powerful. She had knowledge. She had patience. And she had a quiet determination that would soon turn this encounter into something he never expected. For now, though, the street remained frozen in suspense. The woman in the red dress stood calmly, her arms crossed, her eyes locked on the officer. She had said only a few words, but those words carried the weight of dignity that could not be shaken. The crowd of onlookers sensed it. The partner officer sensed it, and even the first officer, though he would never admit it, felt it too. He had stepped into the encounter believing he had all the power. But something in her silence, in her presence, had begun to shift the balance. It was only the beginning. The street felt heavier as more people noticed the scene. The woman in the red dress stood with folded arms, her yellow car behind her shining under the late sun. Her calmness unsettled the officer in front of her more than shouting ever could. He had expected her to be nervous, to stumble over words, maybe even apologize for something she had not done. Instead, she looked at him with eyes that told a very different story. Eyes that said she had nothing to fear, because she already knew the truth was on her side. The officer tried to tighten his grip on the situation. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Do yourself a favor and tell me how you got this car. People like you don't just buy something like this. She tilted her head slightly, not breaking eye contact. People like me? She asked softly, her voice steady, almost whisper-like, yet sharp enough to cut through the noise around them. The words hung in the air, heavier than the sounds of honking cars or footsteps on the sidewalk. A few onlookers exchanged glances. They had heard it too, and in that moment the officer realized his slip. He tried to brush it off, but the damage had been done. She had caught his prejudice laid bare, and now there were witnesses. Instead of arguing, she reached slowly into her purse. The officer tensed, his hand shifting slightly toward his holster, but she moved with calm precision. From her purse she pulled out her phone, already recording. She held it at her side, not even pointing it directly at him, but everyone could see the small red light on the screen. The officer froze. His partner, still standing near the patrol car, noticed the shift immediately. The crowd of people gathering closer noticed it too. She had flipped the balance. What was supposed to be a moment of control for him had now turned into a stage, and the spotlight was no longer his, it was hers. You pulled me over without cause, she said, her tone calm but carrying enough weight for nearby ears to catch every syllable. I have done nothing wrong. My license and registration are valid. You asked me questions that have nothing to do with the law, and now you are assuming what people like me can and cannot own. That is not law enforcement. That is bias. The words struck him harder than if she had shouted. She was not only speaking to him, She was speaking to every pair of eyes and ears now fixed on them. Each bystander who recorded with a phone, each driver leaning out a window, each passerby who stopped pretending to check their messages. They all heard her. And she made sure of it. The officer shifted uneasily. His eyes flicked toward his partner, then back to her. For the first time, doubt crept into his posture. He knew she was right. Legally, she had already fulfilled her obligation by providing the documents. Everything beyond that, his probing questions, his loaded comments, was unjustified, and now recorded. But pride can be a dangerous thing. He cleared his throat, trying to recover. "Step back and wait while I run your information," he said, voice strained but still carrying authority. She stepped back slightly, folding her arms again. Her face remained calm, her eyes unshaken. Inside, she felt her heart racing, not from fear but from resolve. She had always known one day she might face this situation. She had always told herself that if the moment came, she would not shrink or stay silent. And now here she was, living the test she had prepared for. The officer took the documents back to his patrol car. His partner gave him a questioning look. "She's clean." The partner muttered quietly, as though reminding him that this was not worth pushing. But the first officer ignored him. He sat in the car, pretending to type, though the truth was he was stalling, searching for a way to regain his authority. Minutes passed, and the silence grew louder. The woman remained where she stood, her posture straight, her phone still recording at her side. The crowd had grown larger now. Some whispered to one another. Others simply watched in silence. The air was thick with tension, like a stage where everyone was waiting for the next act to begin. Finally, the officer returned. His jaw was tight, his eyes slightly narrowed. He held the documents out to her, almost reluctantly. "Everything checks out," he said stiffly. She took them back with a small nod, her face calm, her voice controlled. "Of course it does." Her answer was simple, but it cut him deeper than any insult could have. He had spent the last several minutes trying to prove she did not belong in the car she drove, and all he had managed to prove was his own prejudice. Still, he could not leave it there. Pride demanded he have the last word. "Be careful where you drive. This neighborhood isn't safe for outsiders." Her lips curled slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close. She took a single step closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "The only danger here today," she whispered. "When was your assumptions?" He froze. The words hit like a mirror held up to his face, forcing him to see what he had been trying to hide. She turned then, walking back toward her car with measured steps. Her heels clicked against the pavement, each step echoing with the sound of dignity. She opened the door slowly, slid inside, and started the engine. The yellow car purred to life, its sound blending with the hushed murmurs of the crowd. But before pulling away, she rolled down the window and looked at him once more. Her voice carried clear across the street. "Wrong target," she said. Then she drove off, leaving the officer standing in silence, the weight of her words pressing down heavier than the summer heat. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the story had already started to spread. Phones that had recorded the encounter buzzed with notifications as people shared what they had seen. Some walked away shaking their heads, others nodding with quiet admiration. The woman in the red dress had done something rare. She had turned a moment meant to humiliate her into a moment that revealed the truth. The officer stood motionless, his pride wounded, his authority weakened. His partner approached, voice low but firm. "You pushed too far. She knew her rights better than you did, and now everyone else knows it too." For the officer, it was a bitter pill to swallow. For the woman, it was a quiet victory. She had not raised her voice. She had not broken the law, and she had not lost her composure. She had stood tall, calm, and unmovable, and in doing so, she had not only defended herself, she had shown others watching that dignity could be a shield, and knowledge a sword. That night, videos of the encounter began to appear online. Captions read things like, "Woman shuts down officer with pure grace," and "Wrong target indeed." Comments poured in, praising her courage, her composure, her strength. Many shared their own experiences, inspired by the way she stood firm. But for her, it was not about the videos, the views, or the praise. For her, it was about something much deeper. She had faced prejudice and refused to bow. She had faced intimidation and answered with truth. And in doing so, she had turned what could have been a moment of weakness into a moment of power. She knew this was only the beginning. Encounters like this happened every day in countless places to countless people. But maybe, just maybe, her stand would remind others that silence was not the only option, that calmness could be stronger than rage, that knowledge could be stronger than bias. And so, as she drove through the city streets, her red dress glowing in the reflection of the setting sun, she carried with her not just the weight of what had happened, but the promise of what it meant. She was not just driving a yellow car through the heart of the city. She was driving a message that dignity, courage, and truth could outshine even the darkest assumptions. And that message was only beginning its journey. The city did not forget what happened that day. The video of the woman in the red dress spread quickly, bouncing from phone to phone, then spilling onto social media platforms where it traveled like fire. Within 24 hours, thousands of people had seen it. By the end of the week, it had been shared across the country. People called her brave. They called her powerful. Some simply called her unforgettable. But for the woman herself, the days that followed were quieter. She returned to her work, to her daily life, and to the responsibilities that had always defined her. Yet everywhere she went, she carried the weight of eyes that now recognized her. Sometimes strangers would approach her in grocery stores or cafes, thanking her for standing tall. Sometimes they whispered as she walked by, nudging one another with the same words repeated again and again. That's her. That's the woman from the video. She had not sought fame, and she did not crave attention. What she wanted was respect. Respect for herself and respect for people like her who were too often judged before being understood. But now, with the video out in the world, she realized something bigger was beginning. Her moment on that street was no longer just her own. It had become a symbol, and symbols carry power. Meanwhile, the officer found himself walking into a storm he had not prepared for. At the precinct, whispers followed him down the hall. Some of his colleagues avoided eye contact. Others shook their heads in disapproval. His commanding officer called him into a meeting where the video was played on a screen, his words echoing uncomfortably in the conference room. People like you don't just buy something like this. The phrase clung to the walls like a stain that could not be scrubbed clean. He tried to defend himself. He said he was just doing his job. He claimed the woman had exaggerated. But the recording was clear, and no explanation could erase the evidence. For years he had worked with the belief that authority gave him the final word. Now for the first time he was learning that the final word was not his to claim. The community demanded answers. Local newspapers picked up the story, framing it as part of a larger conversation about bias in law enforcement. Activists began to rally, using the woman's calm defiance as an example of how to respond with dignity in the face of injustice. Her words, "The only danger here today was your assumptions," were printed on posters, shared in captions, and quoted in speeches. She had become the voice of something larger than herself. But in her own heart, she wrestled with conflicting feelings. She was proud of what she had done, yes, but she also felt the weight of exposure. Fame can be both a shield and a burden. Strangers reached out to her, many with gratitude, but others with skepticism, even hostility. Online debates raged beneath the video, some calling her a hero, others questioning her motives. One evening, she sat alone at her kitchen table, scrolling through the comments. Thousands of messages flowed across her screen, some uplifting, some cruel. She closed her eyes, pressing her palms against the cool wood of the table. She had not asked for this, but she also could not walk away from it. The moment had chosen her, and now she had to decide what to do with it. The answer came to her quietly, like a seed planted deep in her chest. She remembered the faces of people who had stopped her in the streets, their voices trembling as they thanked her. She remembered the young girl who had run up to her outside a store, eyes wide, saying, "You made me feel brave." That was when she understood. This was no longer about one woman in a red dress. This was about giving others permission to stand tall too, so she began to speak. She accepted invitations to community meetings, where she shared her story with honesty and grace. She told the truth about what had happened on that street, not to shame but to inspire. She reminded people that knowing their rights was not arrogance but protection. She encouraged them to stay calm, even in the face of disrespect, because dignity could disarm prejudice more effectively than anger ever could. Crowds listened. Some wiped away tears. Some clenched their fists with determination. She was not preaching. She was simply telling her truth. And in that truth, people found pieces of their own lives reflected back at them. The officer, meanwhile, found his days growing heavier. Every shift felt longer than the last. He avoided certain neighborhoods, knowing the stares would follow him. He noticed the distance forming between him and his colleagues, some of whom no longer trusted him to handle tense situations without letting bias creep in. His once steady career now trembled like a building on shaky ground. Late at night, he replayed the moment in his mind. The yellow car, the red dress, the unbroken gaze. He remembered how she had spoken, not with anger, but with certainty. It haunted him more than shouting ever could have. For the first time in his life, he began to question not just what he had done, but who he had become. But for the woman, there was no time to dwell on the officer's struggle. Her focus was forward. Each day she found herself more deeply drawn into the role of advocate. She began organizing small workshops, teaching others how to protect themselves legally, how to record interactions, how to remain calm when facing unfairness. She never framed herself as a hero. She simply reminded people that courage was not about never feeling fear. It was about standing firm even when fear tried to pull you down. Her story reached further. Local television stations interviewed her, then national outlets. She sat in chairs under bright studio lights, speaking to audiences she would never see in person. And every time, she returned to the same message: dignity, knowledge, and calm could turn the tables on prejudice. But even as her influence grew, she remained the same woman at heart, the woman who loved her work, who cared deeply for her family, who found peace in quiet moments away from the noise of the world. Fame had touched her life, but it had not changed her soul. What had changed, however, was the way people looked at her. No longer just a face in the crowd, she had become a symbol. And symbols once born have lives of their own. They inspire, they challenge, they provoke, they endure. The yellow car still turned heads when she drove it, but now it carried a story with it. People pointed not just because of its shine, but because of what it represented. The red dress, once simply a choice of elegance, had become a uniform of resilience in the eyes of those who remembered. She knew there would be more challenges ahead. She knew not everyone would understand or support her. But she also knew this. The moment on that street had revealed a truth she could never again ignore. She had power, not the kind that comes from wealth or fame, but the kind that comes from courage and conviction. And that kind of power could not be taken away. As she walked into each new day, she carried with her the echo of her own words, spoken with calm certainty on that summer afternoon. Wrong target. Words that had started as a defense had grown into a rallying cry. Words that reminded her and everyone else that truth will always outshine prejudice, no matter how dark the moment may seem. And in that truth, a movement was quietly growing. The days turned into weeks, and the story that had begun on a busy street corner refused to fade. The woman in the red dress found herself caught between the world she had always known and a new world that demanded her presence. She had never asked for a stage, but one had been built beneath her feet. Every time she stepped into a meeting, a school, or a community gathering, people leaned forward as if her words carried the weight of their own unspoken struggles. She told her story with honesty, never exaggerating, never adding details for drama. The truth itself was powerful enough. She described the officer's words, the tension in the air, the silence she had chosen over anger, and the calmness that had become her shield. People listened, sometimes with tears in their eyes, sometimes with clenched jaws, as if they were reliving their own moments of being dismissed or judged unfairly. Her story was not just hers anymore. It had become theirs too. She noticed something each time she spoke. People did not just want to hear about the encounter. They wanted to know how she had remained so calm. They wanted to know how she had held her ground without raising her voice. And so she began to explain. She told them that dignity was a choice, that knowledge was preparation, and that silence could sometimes be louder than shouting. She encouraged them to remember their rights, to carry themselves with strength, and to understand that being calm did not mean being weak. Her workshops grew. At first, they were held in small community centers with only a handful of people sitting in folding chairs. Soon they filled larger halls. Teachers brought students. Parents brought children. Even elders who had lived through decades of prejudice came to sit quietly, listening to her words as if hearing confirmation of something they had always known but rarely spoken aloud. The officer, meanwhile, lived in a different kind of spotlight. The video that had once been just a local story now followed him everywhere. He was transferred out of the neighborhood where the incident had happened, a quiet attempt by his department to calm tensions. But the damage was done. Wherever he went, eyes followed him, not with respect but with doubt. He was no longer the enforcer of order. He had become the face of bias, and it weighed on him more heavily than the badge he wore on his chest. At night, he found no peace. He replayed the encounter over and over in his head, hearing her voice, seeing the way she had stood unshaken. He told himself he had only been doing his job, but deep down he knew that was not the truth. He had not stopped her because of the car, or the traffic, or the law. He had stopped her because of his own assumptions, and those assumptions had now become his undoing. The woman did not waste her time thinking about him. She focused instead on the ripple effect her story had created. Messages flooded her inbox from people she had never met, letters from across the country, even from other parts of the world. Some were from individuals who had faced similar situations. Others were from young people who had seen her video and felt braver because of it. One letter came from a girl barely 12 years old who wrote in shaky handwriting, "When I saw you stand tall, I believed I could too." That letter stayed with her. She pinned it to her wall, a reminder of why she could not step back now. She understood that the attention would eventually fade, as all viral stories do. But if she used this time wisely, she could plant seeds that would keep growing long after the cameras moved on. She began working with local leaders to develop programs that taught not just rights and laws, but resilience and self-respect. She spoke at schools, not with the polished language of politicians, but with the simplicity of someone who had lived what she was teaching. Her words carried weight because they were rooted in experience, not theory. One evening, she was invited to speak at a large gathering downtown. The hall was packed. Teachers, students, parents, activists, and even people who had never attended such events before. The air was thick with anticipation. She stepped onto the stage, not in a red dress this time, but in a simple blue outfit. Still, the audience saw her not for her clothes, but for her presence. She began by telling the story once more. She described the flashing lights, the officers' questions, the crowd that had gathered. But then she shifted, turning the story into something larger. "We cannot always control how others see us," she said, her voice steady, her eyes scanning the room. "But we can control how we see ourselves. And when you know your worth, no one else's assumptions can take it away." The crowd erupted in applause, not just because of her words, but because of the conviction behind them. Many stood clapping with tears in their eyes. In that moment, she was not just a woman who had defended herself on the street. She was a leader carrying the weight of many voices with her own. But with recognition came resistance. Not everyone celebrated her message. Some criticized her online, twisting her story into something it was not. Some said she had set the officer up. Others accused her of seeking fame. The hate came in waves, sharp and cutting, designed to silence her. She read some of the words, felt the sting of them, and then closed her laptop. She knew that if she allowed those voices to define her, she would lose sight of the people who truly mattered, the ones who looked to her for courage, for inspiration, for hope. So she carried on, even stronger. In quiet moments, she still returned to her yellow car, driving through the city streets with the window down, feeling the wind against her face. The car had once been just a possession, a piece of metal and paint. Now it felt like a symbol of survival, of dignity, of truth. Every time she touched the steering wheel, she remembered the day she refused to be broken. Her journey was far from over. She knew that movements do not begin and end with one moment. They grow slowly, shaped by countless voices. But she also knew that one person's stand can light a spark, and that spark can grow into a fire. The woman in the red dress had never planned to become that spark. Yet here she was, carrying a flame that others now relied on. It was a heavy responsibility, but she carried it with grace. The same grace she had shown on that hot summer day when she told an officer, "The only danger here today was your assumptions." And as her story spread further, touching lives she would never meet, she began to realize something deeper. She had not just trapped the officer in his own game. She had set countless others free from the games they had been trapped in their whole lives, the games of fear, silence, and doubt. Her story had become their story. And together they were writing something new. The woman's life had changed, but her heart remained steady. She had not asked to be a symbol, but the world had given her that role, and now she carried it with quiet determination. Every morning when she looked at herself in the mirror, she reminded herself of something simple. Courage is not about the absence of fear. It is about the choice to stand tall, even when fear is present. That reminder kept her grounded when the world around her tried to lift her too high or drag her too low. By now, she had spoken in schools, community centers, churches, and even town halls. Everywhere she went, the story followed her. The image of her standing in a red dress beside a yellow car had become iconic, printed on posters and painted into murals. For some, she was a hero. For others, she was a troublemaker. But for those who truly listened, she was a teacher, teaching not from books but from lived truth. She began to see how much her story mattered to people who had never even met her. In small towns far away, people wrote letters describing how they had faced their own encounters with prejudice and how her calmness gave them a new way to respond. One young man said he had once been stopped unfairly, and instead of yelling in anger, he remembered her words, kept his voice steady, and walked away with dignity intact. Another wrote that her strength gave her the courage to report injustice at her workplace. Each story filled her with both pride and humility. But the journey was not without hardship. The more visible she became, the more criticism came her way. Anonymous messages filled her inbox, some filled with hateful words meant to wound. Strangers on the internet questioned her motives, twisting her story into something it was never meant to be. Some even claimed she had staged the encounter for attention. She read their words late at night, her chest heavy with the weight of misunderstanding. For a moment she wondered if speaking out had been worth it. Then she remembered the little girl's letter, the one with shaky handwriting that said, "When I saw you stand tall, I believed I could too." She thought of the countless faces in her workshops, the eyes shining with hope, the hands that reached for hers after she spoke. That was her answer. She could not let the noise of hate drown out the quiet voices of those who needed her. So she pressed on. She decided to build something lasting. With a small group of supporters, she began creating an organization dedicated to empowerment. Its mission was simple: to teach people their rights, to encourage calm strength in the face of prejudice, and to remind everyone that dignity is not something anyone can take away. They called it the Stand Tall Project. At first, it was just a name and a dream, but soon it became real. Volunteers joined. Donations came in, sometimes only a few dollars at a time, but they added up. With the money, she began hosting larger events, offering free workshops and printing educational materials. Word spread quickly, and soon people from neighboring cities asked her to bring the project to their communities too. Through it all, she stayed true to herself. She never pretended to be perfect. She told her audiences that she had been afraid on that street, that her heart had pounded in her chest. But she explained that fear did not control her. It reminded her that the moment mattered. That honesty made people trust her even more, because they saw her not as someone untouchable, but as someone real. Meanwhile, the officer who had once stood so tall in his uniform was now shrinking in silence. His department had disciplined him quietly, hoping the storm would pass. But he could not escape the shadow of the video. Every time he walked into a room, he felt the weight of judgment. Every time he stopped someone on the street, he felt the eyes of bystanders watching more closely than before. His authority had been shaken, and he knew it. He tried to bury himself in work, but the memory of her words followed him like a shadow. The only danger here today was your assumptions. They echoed at odd times, when he sat in traffic, when he stood in line at a store, even when he tried to sleep. He could not shake them because deep down he knew they were true. One evening, after another long shift, he sat alone at his kitchen table. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through articles about the woman. Her face was everywhere now. He saw her on the news speaking calmly to interviewers. He saw her at rallies, her voice steady even before large crowds. He saw her inspiring others to stand tall, to stay calm, to know their worth. And in all of it, he saw his own failure reflected back at him. For the woman, the growing movement brought both fulfillment and challenge. She was constantly on the move, traveling from place to place, speaking, teaching, organizing. Some nights she collapsed into bed, exhausted from the weight of it all. But when she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of those she had met along the way. The young boy who said her story gave him hope. The mother who thanked her for showing her children that strength could be quiet. The elder who told her she was carrying the torch of generations past. Those faces reminded her that the work mattered, that every ounce of energy was worth it. Her story was no longer just about one confrontation on a hot afternoon. It was about change. It was about resilience. It was about proving that dignity could outlast prejudice. And as she looked at what had grown from that single moment, she realized something powerful. She had turned pain into purpose. She still drove her yellow car, though now it felt less like a possession and more like a symbol. Every time she slid into the driver's seat, she remembered the eyes of the officer who had doubted her, the weight of his questions, the silence of the crowd. And she remembered how she had refused to bow. That memory gave her strength for every new challenge. The red dress, carefully folded in her closet, remained untouched. She had worn it only once since that day for a special event. But in her heart, she knew the dress was no longer just fabric. It was a reminder of who she had been in that moment. Calm, unshaken, strong. One evening, as she prepared for another speech, she looked out the window at the city lights and thought about how far she had come. She had gone from being one woman standing on a sidewalk to being the voice of thousands. And though she sometimes felt the weight of that responsibility, she also felt gratitude. She knew that not everyone gets the chance to turn their story into something that helps others. She had that chance and she would not waste it. For the officer, the silence grew heavier. He found himself avoiding mirrors, avoiding conversations, avoiding the truth. But the truth always waits. And eventually it finds its way back. For the woman, the truth was her strength. She had faced it on that summer day and chosen to embrace it, even when it was difficult. And that choice had changed everything, not just for her, but for everyone who now looked to her as proof that standing tall could change the world. And in her heart, she knew. This was only the beginning. The woman's name had traveled farther than she ever imagined. It was spoken in classrooms, in community centers, in places she had never set foot in. People wrote about her in newspapers and magazines, calling her a symbol of strength and dignity. But to her, she was still the same woman who had once stood on a busy street corner, facing flashing lights and unfair questions. She never allowed herself to forget that moment, because it was the root of everything that followed. Her project had grown beyond the city. Requests poured in from towns and states far away, asking her to visit, to speak, to teach. She began to spend more time on the road, her yellow car replaced by planes and trains as she carried her message to new places. At each stop, she found people ready to listen, people who were tired of being silent, people who were hungry for courage, people who needed to be reminded of their worth. One evening, she stood backstage at a large auditorium, waiting to be introduced. She could hear the murmur of the crowd beyond the curtains. Hundreds of people had filled the seats. Some clutched notebooks ready to write down her words. Others sat with arms crossed, their eyes fixed on the stage as if daring her to move them. She adjusted her jacket, took a deep breath, and reminded herself of the lesson she always carried. Speak the truth, nothing more, nothing less. When she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. The lights warmed her skin, and the expectant faces of strangers stretched out before her. She began, as always, with her story. She described the day, the flashing lights, the officer's questions, the silence that grew heavier with each passing moment. She told them how she chose not to shout, not to break, but to stand tall. And then she told them why. Anger is easy, she said, her voice calm but firm. But calmness is power. When you know your worth, no one can shake you. When you stand tall, you teach others how to stand too. The audience leaned in. Some nodded. Some whispered softly to the person beside them. And as she spoke, she felt the same strength she had felt on that street. The strength of knowing that her truth mattered. But behind the applause and admiration, challenges still lurked. Not everyone welcomed her message. There were critics who called her a disruptor, voices that accused her of fueling division instead of healing it. Some tried to discredit her work, digging into her personal life, looking for flaws to expose. She felt the sting of their attacks, but she refused to let them define her. She reminded herself that even the strongest truth will face resistance. What mattered was how she responded. In her quieter moments, away from the stage and the noise, she reflected on the path she had taken. She thought about the young people she had met, their eyes bright with hope. She thought about the elders who told her she reminded them of battles they had fought long ago. She thought about the letters she still kept in a box, filled with words from strangers who said her story had given them strength. Each memory reminded her why she could not stop now. The officer, meanwhile, lived in the shadow of regret. Months had passed since that afternoon, but the memory of it still clung to him. His career had not ended, but it had changed. Promotions that once seemed certain slipped away. Trust that once felt unshakable had cracked. His colleagues treated him differently, some with pity, others with quiet judgment. He wore his uniform each day, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like weight. He thought about reaching out to her, though he did not know what he would say. Apologies felt too small, too late. Yet he could not escape the thought that perhaps her strength was the very thing he lacked. While she had faced him with calmness, he had faced her with bias, and the world had seen the truth of it. For the woman, the journey continued forward. She began to build partnerships with educators, lawyers, and community leaders. Together, they created programs that taught not only rights and laws, but also confidence and dignity. She wanted young people to grow up understanding that their worth was not defined by anyone else's assumptions. She wanted them to know that calmness was not weakness, but a choice rooted in strength. She often returned to the neighborhood where it all began. She walked the same sidewalks, passed the same shops, and sometimes stood near the very spot where the yellow car had once been pulled over. Each time she felt the echoes of that moment, the weight of the silence, the eyes of the crowd. It humbled her to remember that such a simple act, standing tall, could ripple outward into something so much greater. Her family supported her, though they worried about the toll it took. They saw her exhaustion after long days, the strain in her voice after speeches, but they also saw her purpose. They saw how her eyes lit up when she spoke about the people she had met, the lives she had touched. They knew this was not just something she did, it was something she was called to do. Late one night, as she sat by her window with a cup of tea, she allowed herself to imagine the future. She pictured a world where stories like hers were no longer needed, where dignity was no longer questioned, where people stood tall without fear of being judged by their skin, their gender, or their presence in a certain place. She knew that world was far away, but she also knew it could not come unless people like her took the first steps toward it. And so she vowed to keep walking, no matter how heavy the path became. She vowed to keep speaking, no matter how loud the critics grew. She vowed to keep standing, because she knew others were watching, learning, and gathering strength from her example. Her story had started on a sidewalk with flashing lights, but it had grown into something she could not have imagined. It was no longer just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. It was about everyone who had ever been doubted, dismissed, or disrespected. It was about proving that one person's courage could inspire countless others to find their own. As she finished her tea and set the cup aside, she felt the quiet strength of her resolve. She was tired, yes, but she was also ready. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new critics, new opportunities, and she would face them the way she always had, calm, steady, unshaken, because once you learn to stand tall, you never go back to bending. The story of the woman in the red dress had traveled so far that it no longer belonged to one city, one neighborhood, or even one country. It had become a story people told each other in living rooms, classrooms, coffee shops, and offices. They spoke her name with admiration, sometimes with disbelief, but always with recognition. She had become more than a woman standing beside a yellow car. She had become a reminder of what dignity could do in the face of prejudice. Yet even as the world celebrated her, she remained grounded. She still woke each morning to the sound of her alarm clock, brewed her coffee the same way, and tied her hair in front of the same mirror. Fame had changed the way people looked at her, but it had not changed her heart. She still carried the quiet strength of that afternoon, the steady calmness that had defined her in the face of flashing lights and unfair questions. Her project, the Stand Tall project, had grown beyond her expectations. It now had chapters in several cities, each run by volunteers inspired by her story. Workshops were held weekly. Educational programs spread into schools. Young people who once doubted their voices now spoke with confidence. Communities that had felt silenced for years began to find their footing again. The woman watched all of this unfold with pride, but also with humility. She often reminded those around her, "This is not about me. This is about us. It is about what we can do together." One evening, she was invited to speak at a national conference. Leaders, educators, and activists from across the country had gathered in a vast hall filled with lights and banners. The scale of it was unlike anything she had experienced before. As she walked onto the stage, applause rose like a wave, rolling through the audience until the hall seemed to vibrate with energy. She stood there for a moment, taking it in, then lifted her hand to quiet the crowd. She began, as always, with the truth. She described that afternoon in her yellow car, the officer's voice, the silence of the crowd, and the way she had chosen to stand firm. But then she went further. She spoke about fear, about how it follows people in quiet ways, how it tries to bend them into silence. And she spoke about choice, the choice to answer fear with courage, the choice to stand tall even when your knees tremble. Courage, she told them, her voice echoing through the hall, is not about never being afraid. Courage is about being afraid and still standing. It is about knowing your worth even when the world tells you otherwise. And it is about remembering that your calmness is not weakness, it is your strength. The crowd erupted into applause again, but this time it was not just noise. It was the sound of hearts moved, of spirits lifted, of people reminded of their own strength. Some in the audience wiped away tears. Others stood to their feet, clapping with unshakable energy. The woman looked out at them and felt a deep sense of purpose. She had not just told her story. She had helped them find their own. Far away, the officer watched her on television. He sat alone in his small living room, the glow of the screen casting light across his tired face. He listened to her words, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel the full weight of regret. He remembered the arrogance in his tone, the disbelief in his eyes, the silence that followed her calm defiance. He remembered thinking he had control, only to realize she had taken it from him without ever raising her voice. He turned off the television and sat in silence. He knew he could not undo what had happened, but he also knew he could choose what to do next. For too long he had clung to his pride. Now he felt something different, an urge to change. Perhaps her story had not just exposed his failure. Perhaps it had also given him a chance to become better. The woman never heard about his reflections. She had no time to dwell on him. Her focus remained on the people in front of her, the children who looked up at her with wide eyes, the parents who thanked her with tears in their voices, the strangers who sent her letters filled with gratitude. She knew the work was not easy, and she knew the critics would never fully disappear, but she also knew that the seeds she had planted were beginning to grow, and that was enough. Months later, she was invited back to her own city for a celebration. The community gathered in the park, music played, and banners were hung high. In the center of it all, an artist unveiled a mural. Painted on the wall was her image, standing beside her yellow car, her arms folded, her eyes steady. But around her, the artist had added dozens of smaller figures, children, elders, men and women of all walks of life, standing tall beside her. The mural was not just of her. It was of everyone she represented. She stood before it, her heart swelling with emotion. She had never sought to be immortalized in paint or stone. But as she looked at the mural, she realized it was not about her face or her car. It was about the message, the legacy, the reminder that dignity could transform not just one moment, but many lives. As the sun set that evening, she walked to her yellow car, still gleaming under the fading light. She opened the door, slid into the seat, and rested her hands on the wheel. She thought back to the very first moment, the flashing lights, the officer's voice, the crowd's silence. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet also like yesterday. That moment had changed her life, yes, but more importantly, it had changed others too.